Can you hear? Okay. All righty. Well then, let's begin. Tonight we have the pleasure of having as our guest Walter Pincus. Mr. Pincus has worked in, I think, a greater variety of news organizations than any of the guests that we have had. And you can speak from a perspective of a magazine, because you worked at the Reporter magazine, newspapers. You've worked at the New York Times, at the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Star, Washington Post, and also for television at NBC and CBS. So you've had a varied career in that way, and you also have had a varied career in that you have gone out of reporting and have worked in government for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, conducting investigations, and also worked for the Army in counterintelligence. So you've had a lot of different ways in which to see the subject that we're looking at, which is the press, the president, and democratic society. And,
or I couldn't hold a job.
Yeah, well, I'd say by the awards you've won, a George Polk Award and the Pulitzer Prize, that you seem to do quite well, and an Emmy. Is there anybody who's won both television and print? In looking at all the different places that you've been, and particularly in looking at having served in government and then reported on it, what did you find that you knew in government, like when you were working in counterintelligence? Did you find that there was a lot more that you knew about what was going on in government and well, I guess in the national security area that the public could not know?
Well, it's hard to explain. I was in the I was drafted at the end of the Korean War, and prior to that, I literally just graduated from school, and then knew I was going to be drafted in 6 or 7 months, so I became a copy boy on the New York Times, and that was my sort of journalistic experience going into the Army. The Army, my whole career is sort of one lucky thing after another. In the Army, I was in the last group that was drafted into counterintelligence. And as part of your training, they teach you how to do interrogation. Not interrogation the way you're reading about it now, but real interrogation, in which the whole object is to gain develop a relationship with somebody you're trying to question. That's the only way to get information out. You really don't get anything trustworthy by beating the hell out of them. But that, I was still in my 20s. And when I get out of the Army, I started off initially with the Wall Street Journal in a training program, which had me for the first year doing glorified proofreading and sort of on a desk job. And then the second year is supposed to go to reporter. But because I was working in the afternoons on the desk and this odd journal schedule, which in those days was only published 5 days a week, my mornings were all free. And then through a friend of mine who was in the Army with me, I became the Washington correspondent of the Goldsboro News Argus, circulation 10,000, at $1 a printed inch. And in those 2 or 3 years, I had to compete with the wires and everybody else. And I developed the habit of reading documents, which has sort of stuck with me the whole time. And in the first or second year, I discovered the Democratic State Committeeman actually was secretly running a business on the side, helping get contracts for a contractor down in North Carolina, which the Goldsboro News Argus was nervous about printing. So the editor, who was a really wonderful man, turned the information over to the then governor of North Carolina. And about 3 weeks later, there was a big announcement of this fellow's resignation and a full-scale investigation of him. And at that point, the Goldsboro News-Argus published a story about the governor's announcement and then published my story next to it with an introduction from the editor saying this was written 3 weeks earlier, it was held, and it sort of made me an investigative reporter, whatever that is. And that's kind of stuck with me, and I've done that kind of reporting ever since.
What did you think about the story being withheld and that the way that it worked?
I understand why he did it. I didn't have a real track record. They weren't used to running those kind of stories. I was an outsider. It was all done from documents up here. And I was, 24 years old or 25. And
Yeah.
the fact that it was published got me about $25. So.
What documents were you regularly reading at that time?
Well, in order to compete with the wires, you didn't go to press conferences. Everybody was there. And so one of the training you get when you were counterintelligence is sort of how to do records checks. And this story literally came out of the tax court. The tax court had called this fellow up because he hadn't fully reported on the fees he was getting from this construction company. So he was in tax court over those fees. And nobody down there knew it. My second great scoop for North Carolina was reading congressional hearings, particularly the House Appropriation Committee hearings are the best hearings about government. And they used to be printed rather quickly. And particularly the defense ones used to be 600-700-page volumes. And this was a period of time when they were worried about the Russians and submarine missile attacks, and so they were dispersing the B-52 bombers that we had as our great strategic force against the Russians to deter them. And they were, instead of keeping them at 1 or 2 bases, they were then going to disperse them. And I read the hearings literally from the year before, in which they put a list of the bases that were going to be used to disperse B-52 bombers. And one of the bases was Seymour Johnson Air Base right outside Goldsboro. And nobody in North Carolina knew about it, although it had been in a publication a year earlier. So that was another sort of great scoop.
One of the reporters who was known for his work on documents was I.F. Stone.
I knew him.
And yeah, so you all must have been running into
He was
each other.
He was one of the people that I met when I was just starting out, and in a total different atmosphere. Washington was a smaller town. The journalistic community was much smaller. There were maybe 7 or 8 of us who were all roughly the same age, who used to have dinner once a month and invite somebody our age who was an assistant to a secretary of state or assistant to somebody to come talk to us, just about how government worked. I mean, there's a lot more interest in how government worked than there is today, but there were also fewer. It was less of what I say now is essentially a PR society that runs government. In those days, if you want to talk to a senator, you used to go see him. There were no everybody didn't have press secretaries. There weren't press conferences 2 or 3 times a day from the White House or the Pentagon or the State Department. There may have been 2 or 3 congressional hearings. Instead of from Tuesday to Thursday, there are now 50 and 60 hearings a day, all of which are designed to create information to get into the newspaper by somebody. And so you essentially now have what I call government by PR. And there's the Times' famous slogan is all news is fit to print. Well, there's too much going on to fit to print, so newspapers have to sort of husband what they're doing because they're not covering everything.
In those kinds of sessions, what are the sorts of people that you had, and how open could they be in talking about what they were doing?
Well, they were a lot more open. There were fewer people. It was less bureaucratic, either on the Hill or in government. I mean, I used to go in the mornings. I still remember the then secretary on the Eisenhower administration. I hate to admit how old I am. In the Eisenhower administration, I was just beginning. The Secretary of Agriculture would have a press conference in his office, and there'd be 8 or 9 of us just standing around the desk, asking him questions. And you didn't have these sort of massive events. Television wasn't there. Television's changed a lot of what's gone on. It's changed our politics, and it's certainly changed the way we cover things.
Can you elaborate on that, about how it's changed, how things are covered?
Well, it's just that things happen in front of you. People have press conferences, not because they want to spread new information or essentially give you a chance to, ask questions, but rather because they have a message, and they're there to give out the message, and no matter what people ask them, they will, if they're controlled, which most politicians and public figures are, they will stick to whatever they think the message ought to be. And they'll fence with any other kind of question. And so the White House, I hate to admit it, I have covered the city for almost 50 years. I've never been to a presidential press conference because I think for me it's a waste of time, because I essentially, and the Post allows me to do it, to pick the stories I'm going to write about, and most of them are not the running story of the day unless I start something and it becomes the running story.
Do you think that there are other ways of getting to these same people, where they make public statements and use television, but then they also have other forums where they provide information?
Well, it depends on, I hate to say it, it depends on who you are, the publication, media you work for, and who you know. And I've got all the advantages that I've just stayed here. So, I started reporting here in 1957. And except for the 2 times I ran investigations for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I've been here. So I've grown up with people. I mean, I use, as an example, your people won't know, a fellow named Les Aspin, who was in the Clinton administration, was Secretary of Defense. I met him when he was a staff member for Robert McNamara in the Pentagon. I knew him when he ran as a congressman. I knew him when he was chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and I knew him when he was Secretary of Defense. So I could call him if I wanted to call him. I knew Rumsfeld when he was a congressman. I knew Cheney when I was covering Iran-Contra, and he was a congressman. One of the advantages you have if you stay in roughly the same area is you grow up and know these people, so you have a greater advantage than somebody coming in cold. One of the downsides of journalism today is that they move everybody around, and you can't get to know people. You can't get to know your subject, can't get to know the history of the subject. And that, combined with the idea that it's now more PR, they're now public affairs people, puts either the member of the administration or the member of Congress in the driver's seat when it comes to reporters, because a lot of them don't have the background to really deal with the subject matter.
Well, those people that you've known over a long period of time, how have you noticed they've changed in terms of the way they deal with the public and the way they deal with information?
Well, the other advantage I have is having worked inside government in the 60s, when I was still in my late 20s and early 30s, I got to see how much time, even back then, was spent designing what was said and what was done for the media.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's always been kind of a game with me, and it's really why I've sort of gone out of my own way to cover the stories, and been lucky enough, thanks to the Post, to cover the stories I think aren't being covered normally.
Mm-hmm.
So I can pick out what I do. I've never, I hate to say it, I've never been a beat reporter. I've never covered the White House or covered the State Department.
Mm-hmm.
I technically cover national security, but I can cover it wherever it exists. I've kind of made a specialty out of intelligence because that's in some ways the hardest thing to cover, and the one where you have to know people because almost everything you're dealing with is classified.
And how do you form those relationships? When did you start covering, in a sense you cover it as a beat, intelligence, because there are institutions within it, and then there, CIA and DIA and all the rest of them, but then you also have to deal with the White House and other institutions. When did you start that as an area of yours, and then how do you work with all of those institutions? Because those are, in that area, it's the most difficult one in forming relationships.
I guess there are a couple ways. One is you meet people along the way. I met George Tenet, who's the former director of CIA, when he worked on Capitol Hill. He started off as a staff member for a senator named John Heinz, who was a personal friend of mine, and then moved on to be a staff member of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the Clinton administration, he was handling intelligence out of the White House till he got to be deputy director and then director. So I've known him for 25, 30 years. I just began by reading about it, writing about it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the investigations I did in '69 and '70 for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was the military and foreign policy. And the agency was deeply involved in that.
Mm-hmm.
So while I was on the staff, I traveled around the world and talked to people who were agency people in every country.
Uh-huh.
And then some of the people who were at the head of the agency, and I met them that way, which was very advantageous, and I sort of wrote about it a lot. The way you really develop sources is that, unlike a lot of other professions, what you do is out there with your name on it. So you interview somebody and you write a story about it. They read the story and they decide whether you're reliable or not.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you make a reputation, and the same goes the other way. I talk to sources and they tell me things. Not everybody tells you things that are true or accurate, or they think they're true, or they think they're accurate, and you then make judgments about them.
Mm-hmm.
In a funny way, my kind of reporting is exactly what intelligence people do in their business. And they write reports and develop sources. Well, I do the same thing, except I do it publicly.
Mm-hmm. But it seems that getting a story right, particularly in that area, is so difficult. Look at the difficulty the White House had in getting the weapons of mass destruction, getting that, whether there were weapons of mass destruction or whether there weren't. You wrote about it in that early period, and you raised questions about whether there really were weapons of mass destruction. How did you have that kind of information, and the White House didn't, or did the White House just decide not to focus on that information, but used other things?
Well, no, I think they had the same information. I'm no genius. The information I got from government people who were following the subject matter. I think what the White House did was to pick that information that that supported their preferred outcome. I mean, they totally believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and where they didn't have the proof, they had allegations, and they were perfectly willing to go with that and to not delay the invasion after it turned out the inspectors in the first 4 or 5 months didn't find anything. Another sort of advantage of doing what I did is that Hans Blix, who was the chief inspector, was somebody that I had met 30 years earlier and had known through the whole period. And I knew him when he was just doing nuclear weapons inspection in Iraq in the 1991 period. And I sort of followed the 91 period when there were inspectors, and so I knew a lot of the inspectors who then went back. So I could talk to them. And Blix thought that Saddam Hussein had stocks of weapons. But after the first 2 or 3 months, when he was receiving intelligence from us and the British and the French and the Germans, and none of it was checking out, then he began doubting. And the inspections could have gone on. It's just that we had determined to go to war.
Do you find that that is a tendency that most White Houses have, that they want to hear what they want to hear? And
I think everybody does it.
Yeah.
I mean, reporters do. And that's one of the things you've got to be careful about.
How can you think of an administration that seemed to have a system built in where they were effective in standing back and saying, is this really right? Do we have the information? Can you think of instances in which that was done and an administration reversed course because they looked at it again?
I mean, one of the great things I learned from Fulbright is in public life, it is very difficult for a politician or a government official to admit a mistake. They really hate to do it. But when Fulbright found out that he was wrong about Tonkin Gulf, that he had been misled, and that the Tonkin Gulf resolution of the Vietnam War is what really set America loose and gave authority, and it was a resolution that he handled, that gave authority to the Johnson administration to increase the number of troops to 125,000 and really injected us into Vietnam and the war. And Fulbright believed what he had been told, that there had been an unprovoked attack on 2 of our destroyers, and therefore by the North Vietnamese, and therefore we had to go in and defend them. And it was after he found out that in fact there were questions about it, and that questions he hadn't asked when the first reports came in, that he confessed that he had made a mistake. And from then on, he was prepared to admit at times when he was wrong, when he was. But that's a view that most politicians don't have, and this administration is proving it in spades.
Yeah. So in a sense that what you have to do is have such a really good system in place that before you get yourself down a course, that you know that you can vouch for the information you have. Now, would that be, like, say, in the White House, that the NSC really should be responsible for the authenticity of information?
Well, you have to start with the intelligence community. I mean, the CIA director used to be the director of Central Intelligence, although he only controlled the CIA. You now have a new kind of layer on top, really brought about by, I think, some ill-thought-out reforms, where you have a director of national intelligence who is the president's chief intelligence advisor, who doesn't, in fact, run anything. He is just kind of a general manager, and most of the overseas intelligence still being collected by CIA, and the domestic by the FBI, and the military is sort of moving into both areas. But John Negroponte has to listen to what people tell him, But unlike the system before, you had a DCI who also ran the CIA, you at least had him in direct control and responsibility for everything that was going on, at least in overseas intelligence. You don't have that now. And I think that's a real problem. But it's his job to make sure the information is clean and pure. The NSC's job is really to manage the different departments and affect the policy that arises out of the intelligence informs the policy, but he doesn't direct it. And so Negroponte has nothing to do with policy. What he has to do is supply the information. And the key part of that is a lot of information gathering deals with whether policies are working or not. And so the key thing is whether your people overseas or your people at home are providing accurate information as to the impact of your policies. And the NSC should be in charge of making sure that that information that may run counter to what the policy is gets through so people can see what works and what doesn't work. When you filter out the bad and just give the good, people are being misled.
Have you seen the NSC operate in that manner?
I think the NSC operates the way a president wants it to operate. There is no standard operating. Every president has changed the function of the NSC. So it really depends on both the president. It depends on what the president wants. And if he wants to get the bad news, he can get it. One of the great stories, one of the stories about Clinton, President Clinton, it's again another odd part about me. My wife is from Little Rock, and I've known the Clintons for 25 years. And she was a presidential appointee, and my oldest son was a president. So I was conflicted and limited what I could do when Clinton was president. But one of the things that happened was he is the first president we ever had who didn't have a personal friend in the CIA. And so the president's daily brief is sort of the creme de la creme of the intelligence from the previous 24 hours, which is given to the president in the morning. And Clinton followed George Bush Sr., who had directed the agency. So he knew everybody. And his morning briefing was taken up with what's called the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, and he always wanted to know the background of who did this, and he remembered that agent, and what leader abroad was being wiretapped, and all that sort of business. So it was a big event. Clinton, and then prior to that was Reagan, who didn't read the PDB, kind of had it described to him, and whose head of intelligence was his former campaign advisor, Bill Casey, so that it was kind of superficial. Clinton actually read it and complained to me after a period of time that he stopped having the briefing because he found nothing new in the PDB, that he often said that he hadn't read in the newspaper. And that was a different sort of way of approaching things. And what he didn't realize is what the president's questions that arose in that 30-minute session then became directives for the intelligence community for the next day. You know, I read this, I want to know more about that, or I read this, more about that. And he got this feeling that there was anything that new, and he was asking questions anyway. So he canceled the briefing, and the word got out, word suddenly leaked out that he wasn't interested in intelligence, which wasn't true. He just thought the briefing was a bore, and he was in the midst of a big economic problem. He actually, you know, they raised taxes, and that was a big issue in the first 3 or 4 months.
Yeah.
And he never realized until I met him one day and we were talking about it, that the briefing was really that these guys worked for him at the agency, and the briefing was designed to give them assignments for the next day.
Uh-huh.
So from then on, he brought the vice president in and some other people. They were there to ask questions. And they modified and changed the PDB. I went out and interviewed the guy who was doing the PDB and wrote a story about it. And the PDB was always 28 pages. I said, well, what if nothing that important had happened the day before? And he said, oh, we have canned stories that we put in. It was just like a newspaper. I mean, it's crazy. Well, it also turned out if you wrote items that got in the PDB, it helped your career. It was kind of a plus.
Uh-huh.
You know, publish your parish. and it was run at that level, which you never sort of sounded crazy at the time. But that's how analysts got promoted, if their stuff regularly appeared in the PDB.
The PDB that came up that Bush had looked at, you know, with Bin Laden in August of 2001. I mean, it really looked like one slapped together thing.
It was. It was. It was an answer to a question he had asked the day before, and then he didn't pay attention to the answer.
Yeah, because well, what tools do you use when you're trying to verify information? You don't have a PDB to look at and to know what's going on. Say, you know, if you're interested in a particular thing, how do you cross-check?
I guess you talk to as many people as you can. One of the misjudgments of people is that somebody gives you a piece of what could be classified information and said this is really secret, and you print it. And you really don't. I mean, I don't. And there are no rules. We're going through this whole internal period of confidential sources and how you decide who to talk to and hanging over it all or subpoenas. What people don't realize is a lot of these stories, the two that interest people now are the Jim Risen story about NSA and the Dana Priest story about CIA prisons for terrorists abroad. I know less about the Risen piece, but I know that Dana was working for months on that piece, talking to a lot of different people. And so to say that somebody, quote, leaked it to her and we're going to find out who leaked it, that is not true. I mean, there are just lots of people. And if somebody tells you a fact and you then check it with somebody else who isn't the original person that you learned it from, is that second person who confirms it a leaker? Or there's a huge amount of misinformation about all this. I'm wrapped up in this Wen-Ho Lee case, in which a nuclear scientist is using the Privacy Act to sue the government on the grounds that information about him was leaked to the press and caused him to be investigated, indicted, and what people do forget is that he pled guilty to a felony, and he's now has a lawsuit against 5 of us. Not against us, against the government, but there are 5 reporters who wrote about him who have been subpoenaed to give up our sources, and none of us have. And so we're all in contempt. And in my case, the judge, when she found me in contempt, ordered me to go back to my sources, or what she said, source, and see if the source was still going to hold me to the original pledge. And that idea was based on the Judy Miller-Valerie Plame case, in which Judy Miller had a source. And in my case, she gave me 48 hours to get them to get whoever it was. And she was under the misapprehension that there was one source. All I had to do was pick the phone up. Well, there were many more than one sources, and some of them didn't even know there was a suit, and some of them were no longer in government and knew nothing about it. So we got it extended to 2 weeks. and we finally got back to everybody.
Uh-huh.
But that's, to me, a perfect example of how the courts, and to some degree the government, doesn't understand how we operate.
Uh-huh. And how does that affect you in terms of your reporting?
Well, I haven't given up, and I was subpoenaed in the Valerie Plain case also, and I wouldn't talk to the prosecutor until my source came forward. He either had to go to the prosecutor or he had to go public.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually he went to the prosecutor. We learned about it, and I was released by him to talk to the prosecutor, but not to the public. So my source has never been disclosed. And I didn't have to answer questions about the conversation because I wrote about it in the paper, which is why I got subpoenaed.
Mm-hmm. But do you find that it...
and because I hadn't disclosed sources, it hasn't affected.
Yeah. But does it affect you in the sense that when you're writing, you think, here I'm going to end up in court over something?
No, I mean, I've done it for 40 some odd years and got 2 subpoenas.
Uh-huh.
We were just going through a bad patch in a way.
Uh-huh.
And I think this will work itself out one way or the other, but it isn't. The 2 stories I mentioned, the Risen story and the Dana Priest story, those leaks both took place after all these subpoenas were out.
Uh-huh.
So people who are going to leak information are still going to do it. Important information. The key is you shouldn't just print it because it's a classified secret. It's got to be meaningful. It's got to be worthwhile printing. And it can't really be endanger people. We hold back a lot of times.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot, but sometimes on classified information because it's not worth putting out the name of somebody who had been a covert agent. That's the great example.
Mm-hmm.
There's no purpose in that.
Uh-huh. Have there been stories that you held that were never printed, or is it usually just a matter of holding them back for a period of time?
I think we're holding back pieces.
Well, like I said,
of
names I can see, that they
Names
would never
you
be
hold back. Well,
released. Yeah.
There's one I did that got the Reagan administration crosswise. The first shuttle that went up carrying a classified payload. The Pentagon had a press conference. Not a press conference, they had a briefing that we weren't at, in which they were making arrangements for the TV coverage of the launch of the first satellite that had a classified package in it. And some Air Force general got up and said, anybody who publishes the capabilities of the package and what it was doing was going to be investigated for espionage. And we weren't at the press conference, the Times was. And the Times wrote a big front page story about how this threat was made, and they had a big analysis of prior restraint and the First Amendment and all this stuff. And Ben Bradley was the editor at the time. And my office was right outside his office. I mean, my desk was outside his office. He came piling out in the morning. He said, "What the hell is on the satellite? I mean, what's the package?" And it took about an hour and a half to find out that it was an eavesdropping satellite that had certain kinds of capabilities. And I put a story together, and I also got interested in why the announcement was made, because it wasn't so shocking. And it turned out that NASA had given a briefing in detail about this satellite. Its capabilities, what it was listening to and how good it was listening to it. And it went to, as I remember it, Air Force Magazine, the LA Times, and NBC, or some group like that. And they had called the Pentagon for confirmation of it. And Weinberger, Defense Secretary, went crazy and guaranteed that nobody, if these people held their stories, nobody else would write about it. And that was his way of solving it by saying anybody wrote about it. And so we wrote that. And Weinberger went batty and said we had violated and we'd be investigated. And we got pickets in front of the building.
Where
Bradley
the pickets
got
come
more
from?
letters.
Where would the pickets come from?
People thought we were too liberal and all the rest of it.
But it blew over.
Oh, yeah, it always does.
Do you think that there was a period, as far as information is concerned, that was better than any other, as far as what
I think
information?
every administration's gotten, and every politician has gotten more sophisticated. They learn from the people ahead of them. I mean, this crowd uses it to extremes. The one who changed it all, this is a story I always tell, the one who changed the way you covered things in this town more than anybody else was Mike Deaver for Reagan. I used to be, I was half owned by the Post and then half owned by CBS during the Reagan administration. And every morning at 8:30, there was at the White House what they call a tech meeting in which essentially the television people were told where the president would appear that day so they could make their arrangement with crews and get setups and all the rest of it. What Deaver did was to make that the story of the day. And so he used that meeting to say, okay, today the president will appear at 10 after 12 in the Rose Garden, make a statement about what the administration is going to do about crime in San Francisco and Chicago as examples of how they're going to deal with things. So that way the TV people could then go to San Francisco and Chicago and shoot background B-roll stuff for their nightly story. And Deaver knew that every network would have a presidential story on because they all had their best correspondents, the correspondents that people wanted to see covering the White House. And so almost every night there'd be a story. The president would appear at 10 after 12, make a statement, leave 10 minutes later, and there'd be a story on that night. And that'd be it. And at the end of the first year, David Broder, our political columnist, wrote a story that in his history, which had gone back a number of presidents, this was the least involved president he'd ever seen. And the mail came pouring in saying, how can you say that? We see him every day. He's doing this, he's doing that. And then what began happening is on the days when there was no setup, Sam Donaldson used to yell at the president when he was going to a helicopter or something. And that'd be a story. And we never used to have a standing slug for a presidential story. But we began doing it. And so every day there was a president. Now, every day there are 2 or 3 of them. And it's not that you know what he's doing. Literally what happened, George Bush then began to be criticized because he'd make the 10-minute appearance, but he'd answer some other question. And then he was accused of sort of going off message. And then Clinton came in and he'd do 4 things in a day. And people would say, well, what's important? He's confusing the public. And the fact is that the president does dozens of things a day. But if you only give one thing out publicly, then you're staying on message, and the coverage of a president, now even the coverage of presidential campaign, is can this person stay on message? Well, in my terms, you're covering the PR of the White House. You're not covering what's going on inside the White House. You're covering what they want to say. The newest twist that I always use is George Bush is in trouble, his polls are going down in Iraq. It becomes a front page story that he's going to have speeches in the next week about Iraq. And then every day he has a speech about Iraq, and there's a story about Iraq in his speech. Well, that's all he's doing is trying to burnish his image. You're not learning anything. It's not what they're doing about Iraq, it's what he's saying. batter up.
Right. But don't presidents traditionally think that they have communications problems when they're really policy problems?
Yeah.
And so...
But we ought to see through it. We
Uh-huh.
shouldn't, it's really not our job to just become a common carrier, and that's more and more what the press is becoming.
Well, one of the things that he's done in this past week that's been somewhat unusual is he's had a series of off-the-record interviews with reporters. And the New York Times did not take part in them, but a lot of news organizations did. And what do you think about those as far as a place of getting information that is in some way useful?
I think you go wherever you can go.
Uh-huh.
And they set the rules for it, and you live by the rules.
Uh-huh.
But, I mean, every president meets with reporters, that always have. I mean, what's unusual about this is that he generally hasn't, but he's met with reporters in the past.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't understand why it became a story, and I think it's silly not to go. I think that's...
Yeah. Well, he's had more of them in one time period. He had a bunch of. He seems to have had several of them at one time period. So I guess it becomes a story. Well, let's take some questions. Towson, do you have a question?
How do you view the new press as far as like the online bloggers and I guess maybe the 24-hour sort of internet service that we have of constant news coming into the public versus say the print press?
Well, I think obviously 24-hour TV coverage has changed. It's really increased the number of sort of prepared events for television, and it's created a whole bunch of sort of commentators who speak off the cuff and fill up time. One of the bad parts of it is that CNN and Fox are running in print newsrooms, and therefore they have an effect way beyond what their real substance is. What people don't realize is Jim Lehrer's audience is bigger than O'Reilly's, but you wouldn't know it because O'Reilly gets so much publicity. But I think it has sort of forced the process and created what I think is false news, kind of PR news. I also think that bloggers are both good and bad. First of all, most of them you wouldn't know about if the mass media, blogging is not a mass media. And the people who pay most attention to bloggers are other bloggers. And none of them would really have much impact if they weren't picked up by what they call the mainstream media. You wouldn't know about them. And some of them do decent work, and some of them are terrible and unreliable, but it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. What are they good for?
Some of them are good for nothing.
Uh-huh. Well, just thinking in terms of fact-checking. Are there some that seem to have come up with information that's useful in the fact-checking line?
Well, if you really consider what are there 500, 1,000 of them, and you could put on one hand what they've really done.
Yeah.
There's one today that some congressional candidate put up a picture of supposedly of how peaceful Baghdad was during his trip. He's a Republican. And it was the bloggers who looked at the picture and saw that it was Turkish language and discovered it was really a photograph of Istanbul, not Baghdad. Well, first of all, you'd have to know that the guy put up the picture in the first place, which most people didn't even care about. And then come along. So it's an amusing story, and it tells you something about a candidate. but it's not earth-shaking. The Dan Rather thing is in my mind a toss-up. People make mistakes all the time, and that it's too bad it's turned out that way. But I think it would have been discovered with or without bloggers. What blogging does in some ways is give very partisan people a chance to rip other people apart. And most of the time they do it very inaccurately. But luckily most people don't see or hear it. I think the most interesting commentary on the media and the new media is Jon Stewart, who I think provides a really interesting balance to things and does a very clever critique of the press and the government that we can't do. And it's in part because he's making fun of things that are serious, but only can be dealt with truthfully by making fun of. So I watch him every night.
Do you think that the partisanship that we have has an impact as far as of how the information flow works?
I think it's got a terrible impact in a way which puts me against most people. I work for Senator Fulbright, who's a Democrat. I am a Democrat. Everybody knows I'm a Democrat. Everybody knew I knew the Clintons. There were stories about him coming to dinner at the house and all that. So everybody knows my bias. And I know it more than they do, so I sort of watch it. But it doesn't stop me from going after issues that I think are important. And people say I do it for whatever reason. I don't care. As long as it's accurate, that's all I care about. I think this idea, this fear of appearing to be subjective, which we all are. There is no such thing as objectivity. I mean, we were all born in this country. It makes objectivity different than if we had been born in Iraq or Canada. I mean, we just look at things differently. So you're not quoted. There is no such thing as objectivity, which drives everybody crazy when I say it. But I think it's true. You have to do the best you can, and you don't have to, in this new era of sort of partisanship, you've got to give all sides. Well, a lot of issues don't have two sides. I mean, there's the best truth you can get at. One of the bad things that's happened in journalism is when I come across something that's new, a fact that I think is important. I'm writing a lot now about an agency called the Counterintelligence Field Activity, created by the Pentagon, a new agency to coordinate all their internal counterintelligence. It's really counterterrorism, and they're operating both here and abroad. And it's repetitious in my mind of exactly what happened in the 60s when they started, the military got into sort of domestic intelligence and began keeping files on peace groups or anybody who disagreed with the administration. We've already found this group has done that here. When I first discovered it and discovered what they were doing, instead of just writing a story, which we would have done 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and then had people comment, there's a whole feeling that somehow you've got to give the information to people. I mean, you certainly give it to the Pentagon. They refuse to comment. But then there's a sudden desire to give it to somebody else who will say, oh, isn't that terrible? You know, go to the Democrats or go to some civil libertarian group, which automatically say terrible. But they don't know what the facts are, you do. So in the old days, you used to print it and then let people respond to it. This new kind of you're not taking positions feeling make people who do enterprise have to go and get some other group to sort of reinforce that what you're writing about is okay. It's not just your idea.
Where does that pressure come from?
It's internal to the news media business. I mean, one of the things people forget, you're getting all these lectures I give to my own students, that the First Amendment was not there to make sure the press is truthful. The First Amendment came at a period of time, the 18th century, when, when, when every newspaper, every publication was either a party publication or some personal guy on a whim. Tom Paine was whacking away at people. And the object of a democratic society is you as a citizen read everything and make up your own mind. Or if you belong to the Federalist Party, you read the Federalist Party paper and you believe it. But the average person was supposed to read everything, make up his own mind. It's not the Post's job to give you all points of view equally and let you make up your mind. The Post ought to take a position. I scare everybody saying Rupert Murdoch runs a paper the way you're supposed to run it. He owns it. Those are his views, and if you want to read that kind of view, you read it. The Washington Times, same way. This idea that the old idea, newspapers used to be owned by families, like Post is, and like the Times, and there's an idea behind all that. Most people got into the newspaper business in the 18th, 19th century because they wanted to get involved in public policy. They wanted to affect what goes on in government. I grew up reading William Allen White, who most people don't even remember, who was an editor of a little newspaper in Kansas and was a Republican politician. He's a wonderful writer. And he became famous by writing, what's the matter with Kansas. But he ran a paper the way I think papers are supposed to be run. John Knight owned a chain of newspapers, the Knight newspapers, and used to print an editorial on the front page of his paper in Akron every Sunday. And that same editorial would be printed in the other papers in Miami and the rest of it. Then they were bought up by the Ritters, and it became Knight Ritter and a corporate publication. And then now last run by Tony Ritter, and his concern was the bottom line. Tony, you couldn't tell me whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, and you couldn't tell by reading the newspaper because they didn't want to take those kind of positions. They're in the business of making money. The television networks, and Gannett's the biggest chain we've ever had. There is no Mr. Gannett. There's no Gannett political point of view. These are papers that are ginning out 20% profit. When I came to the Post, Phil Graham ran the paper, and because I was involved in some kind of investments, we used to talk about it. And the Post was making 7%. And Phil said it's like a public utility. That's a good enough return. Once we went public, I mean, we now make 18 or 20%, but Gannett makes 23 or 24. There's no business in America that makes those kind of profit, except for TV stations. And so that's a big issue, and therefore it drives them to be much more neutral, because most newspapers now, there are only 8 cities in the United States that have competing newspapers. They're all monopolies. And if you start taking positions, you'll encourage somebody else to start publishing. So.
But you're in the curious position that circulation is down, but readership is up, because so many people are reading the papers on the internet. So that there's been a real increase in readership. And I guess there's a question of how to make that pay.
Well, it's a question of how to make it pay at the high levels that these people. I mean, what happened with Gannett, Knight Ritter, and the rest of them, they bought newspapers at exceedingly high prices, went into debt, and therefore, in order to keep their return up, they've got to cut costs. You don't have to make that much money, is my belief. I mean, our readership up, you've got to work the internet and these other sort of elements. I'm half owned by the newspaper, half owned the corporation, so I get involved in some of this. And the fact of the matter is that we are, in a practical sense, in the reporting business with 5 delivery systems. And one of the problems is our delivery systems compete with each other, and therefore they're overstaffed. But the same person which is heresy in the paper, the same person who works for Newsweek works for the same company I work for. If somebody on Newsweek gets a story Monday or Tuesday, it's not going to hold till the next Monday when Newsweek comes out. It really ought to go to the Post. Or if a Post reporter finds something out that's going to break in the next few hours, it ought to go to the website, not wait for the paper for the next day. And so it's all, we've got to somehow work all that out. And somebody who covers a hearing where we can have a camera, the website now has a whole sort of television unit group. Somebody who covers it for the paper can sit there before the hearing starts and say into a camera what's going to happen. We can now have a camera cover the hearing. When the hearing's over, he can take 10 minutes before he goes back to the paper and say, this is what's happened, and they can put it on the website. I mean, all those things are going to happen eventually. We just haven't got around to doing it.
Have they changed for you?
Well, I was half owned by television for 15 years and writing for the paper. So this is all, I did, my Emmy was a documentary that I did for CBS and wrote a series for the Post before the documentary came out. I mean, I think there's a synergy, and the papers are the least modern of any institution I've ever dealt with, and hardest to change. But I think they are going to change, and you're going to have. We're all into electronics now, and we're going to do more of it.
How were you able to develop that system where you were working with both, that you were doing CBS and also the Post?
The one weird part of my life you didn't have is for 2 years I was associate then executive editor of the New Republic. And
that's right.
part of a group was going to buy the New Republic, and we didn't when Marty Peretz bought it. But during that period I became a consultant to NBC because a friend of mine got to be president of NBC News, and I got to doing documentaries and saw the synergy. And then CBS bought up my television contract. And when I left the New Republic and came back to the Post, I told Bradley that I wanted to keep doing television because it's so complex. But in British newspapers, you can be an editor and a writer at the same time. American newspapers, an editor is just an administrative type who doesn't do any writing at all. And my belief has always been if you don't stay reporting, you've lost the whole basis for journalism and what you're doing. And so I wrote for the paper, and I said I wanted to keep this consultancy with CBS, and he didn't like it a bit and refused to do it. And so at that point I went to the Star, which I had worked for before, and the then editor of the Star drew up this 2-paragraph contract that said I would write for the newspaper, but I would have other employment that wouldn't conflict with it. And they try it out for a year, and I had to go back to Bradley because he was an old friend and say I'm going to do this. And Ben, being Bradley, if you knew him, crossed out the Washington Star and wrote it in the Washington Post, and that's been my contract for 30 years.
Bruce, do you have a question?
I was wondering the point about the PR strategy of the government and staying on message. What advice do you give to new reporters about how to handle that? I mean, it seems like your strategy is not to go to the press conference, but is that the
I read them
extent?
all.
What's that?
I read them all. I just don't go there because I wouldn't ask a question.
Well, fair enough. But I mean, how do you, given that there's this army of consultants inside the government keeping candidates on message and suppressing information and shaping the direction of the news, what's the counter strategy that you would give to a young reporter about how to deal with all that?
I think the first thing is you've got to learn how government works and what your beat is. If you start out on a beat, you really have to learn it well, and you've got to read everything and meet people. And that way you can sort of wade through it. Somebody, to some degree, has to cover this stuff. And what you want to do is gain a foundation of how government really works and all the rest of it. And then, which I know is hard, go off on your own and find your own stories. And then prove to editors that there's something more going on than what you see in front of the camera. What's different, which sounds like old people talk, is that at least my generation, you never made enough money being a journalist. So we all wrote for magazines, or we always had 2 jobs because you couldn't support a family. One of the downsides of in my approach to journalism now is that they're paid too much, and then they tend to intermarry, and it becomes a 5-day-a-week, 8-hour job. And to build a foundation, you need to do more than that to break through the system. Otherwise, just flow through the system and you become like everybody else.
Do you think the kinds of dinners that you all used to have, do you think those take place?
Not as often anymore because people don't trust each other. People in government don't. A lot of institutions have changed. The Council on Foreign Relations, I belonged to it for years and years and years. Used to be a place when I first started going there where government officials went to get advice because most of the members had been in government. And they were absolutely fascinating. And they were off the record. And you learned a lot being there. Plus you got to meet people. And nobody broke, the agreement, and they were useful. It then has expanded like gangbusters, and now people go there to put out PR, and it's kind of it's not as half as useful as it used to be. And then this idea that you as a journalist have to not, quote, make friends with people in public life, I think is, because you'll get corrupted, is nonsense. I mean, if you're corrupted by knowing somebody, then you shouldn't be in journalism. Because they then become, because of the PR aspect, one-dimensional figures. When in fact they all, they have wives, they have kids, they wake up sick someday or bad someday or whatever. And you ought to know them as human beings. And the fact you know somebody doesn't mean you can't write when he does something wrong. If that's the basis of a friendship, then it's not much of a friendship. Everybody that I know knows what I do, and at times I've done things they haven't liked, and that's too bad. Some people who are really good friends, I mean, 2 of them, it's the oddity. I helped, get indicted and convicted.
Do you find that over the time period of your reporting that say a White House is different, but if you go into the intelligence community, into the agencies, have you find that those kinds of relationships are different? Are they pretty much the same, the basis on which you deal with them?
No, I think, people in the White House essentially are political.
Yeah. And they come and go, but but people within the bureaucracy, do they just try to lay low and deal the same way that they always have?
Well, some of them do. Some of them reflect. They all have their likes and dislikes too, and they're more open if they agree with the policy. Less open if they agree with the policy and it's going bad, and people go the other way. A lot of people talk to you because some people do it because they just want to appear like they know what's going on. Some people do it because they just enjoy the conversation. There are people who work in the White House who are professionals and then go back to their own agencies. One of the problems, the new problem, which people don't realize, is there are now so many think tanks that have former professional people in government in them, and their new life depends on getting written about. So they want to talk to you, and it's in some cases it's dangerous because they don't know. They talk about facts they don't know about because it kind of helps their current situation to be the person written about saying this, that, or the other thing.
And it's also something that having all of those groups out there. There was an estimate in the National Journal that if you take all the lobbying community together, there's 100,000 people in Washington, and those are people that want to get in, like say they want to get into the president's space, and they want to affect stories, and so it speeds up things. Like when the president had announced that Andy Card was leaving and that Josh Bolten was going to replace him, I think the DNC started sending out stuff about Bolton and about managing the deficits and whatnot. They started sending that out. I think it was before 10 o'clock. John Podesta's group had things out an hour later about Bolton because they were trying to, of course, they're trying to get into the television stories. They knew that there was this giant news hole to talk about this particular story, and so all of them were trying to rush information into it. And that's just something that didn't exist in an earlier time period. And so it seems like there's just more of a potential of error, particularly in television and cable television.
Well, it's just it also is just a PR game. And the idea that the first day, this is my disagreeing with the papers in general, the first day that Bolton is named, you have to do a profile of Bolton, a big long profile of Bolton, with no time to think about it. Well, the other fact is that most people who read the paper are going to read the main story. If they read all the way through, they're unusual. And then read a second story or even a third story about it. One of my pets about newspapers is that we overcover things, particularly that are television events. We don't recognize most people get their news from television. And so we then write 6 stories about some event that has been covered for 24 hours on television. And you talk about us losing circulation. That's one reason why. Why should anybody have to wade through 6 stories? You only read, people read papers for 20 minutes. That's all. And when the paper on Monday is 100 pages long and on Thursday it's 200 pages, they still only read it for 20 minutes. So there's only a limited amount you can read. And I think newspaper editors haven't paid attention to that kind of simple fact.
Towson, you have a question? No question from Towson? Okay, we'll take one from here.
I was just wondering, do you think that there's a difference between the quality in American media and European media, both in print media as well as television? Because it seems that British and French media seems much more critical than American media.
Well, the British have this tradition of their news articles are much more opinionated. So they go off the deep end, and in a way that we don't. I don't know the French situation. The French are essentially party newspapers, and the British are more. You got to remember they're smaller countries. They have national newspapers. We have the Journal and the Times, and USA Today. I read the Financial Times because I think it's essentially a very good newspaper that covers Europe and the Far East better than we do, and do it in a much more concise way. But I don't know about French television. I used to do British television, and their kind of narrative shows, their news shows, they put you on if you will say certain things. I mean, they pre-interview you. We do a lot of this now, and people don't know it. And we do a lot of pre-interviewing of op-ed pieces in American journalism now. They talk to people, you know, they're looking for somebody to take X position. And if you take that position, you go on the air. If you don't, we're looking for somebody who does.
Anybody got a question there?
I have a question. What do you think about the sensationalism of news today? It's very exciting. It's very driven, not necessarily by news, but by, I guess, what drives ratings. It seems. What do you think are the ramifications of that for the future of news?
Well, I think you don't have as much of that as you used to when you had competing newspapers. Because the whole history of newspapers is that the flashier newspaper always won out, not the serious one. So you have that much more in television, and particularly television magazine shows, and less of it now. I think one of the problems with current day newspapers is they want to compete with television on what I consider soft stories, human interest stories. And I mean, nobody can compete with somebody on television crying. I don't care how good a writer you are. You can't beat that for those kinds of stories. I'm just a basic believer in that hard news sells newspapers. Hard news in the front. But everybody forgets that a newspaper is, you know, got funny papers and sports and a good proportion, most readers read newspapers for the ads. So that the news content in the hard news sense is really a small, that's a headline reader for most. Sports is a big thing, entertainment. Newspaper is still the best place to find out movie reviews and what time shows are. I mean, I don't kid myself that most people read newspapers primarily to get news. Most people primarily get their news from radio and television. So we're there really to tell them what happened that you don't know about, or why something happened that you do know about, or what's going to happen next.
What are the documents that you regularly read? So you've told us what newspapers you read. What about documents that you regularly read?
Well, a decent example, the Moussaoui trial that you've all read about. Well, there is, I think it finally, the LA Times wrote a story about it today. There have been in that trial over 80 documents as exhibits that have been released. And while you're covering a trial as a reporter, you have a hard time reading those documents. So I'm just getting all of them printed tonight. We finally got a list. They're all up online. And I'll read them all. Our reporter who's covering the trial didn't cover 9/11, doesn't cover terrorism regularly, he covers the courts. So there's, just in the few I've read, there are some interesting facts in some of the first documents I looked at. So I'll read the whole mess of them over the weekend.
Are there ways within the paper that you all regularly get together and talk about stories where your interests and knowledge intersect?
Yeah, we have a regular meeting about political stories by all the political writers, regular meetings of terrorism is a big subject. A whole bunch of us cover pieces of, and we meet once a week or every other week about that. There are a bunch of us involved in national security, and we'll do that. I mean, a lot of what I do, so I don't have to cover the running story if I don't want to, is I've got a story tomorrow that's based on a case called the APAC case, which to me a case in which two lobbyists have been indicted for violation of the Espionage Act. And they're two lobbyists for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, who are civilians. First time any civilians have been indicted on the Espionage Act for receiving and transmitting classified information. To me, it's a worse threat to journalists and to academics and to everybody else. The way the government's using it than either the Plain case or Winholy. And the judge in this case had a hearing on a motion to dismiss the indictment on Friday, and nobody covered it. We didn't cover it. Times didn't cover it. Nobody covered it. AP had a very short story afterwards. And so I got the transcript on Monday and wrote a story based on it, and there was no space yesterday, so it'll be in the paper tomorrow. And that's because I read the transcript.
And what are some of the other things? Do you go through the Federal Register?
I used
Is
to
that
write a
useful?
column about the Federal Register. And no, I don't see it anymore. And Congressional Record is something I used to look at. One of the terrible things about email now is I kill an hour almost every morning because I get 60, 70, depends on emails a day, a night. So it takes a long time to go through them, and some of them you have to answer, and some of them, a lot of them are just releases, and we have a system that cleans out that overlap stuff. You can stop getting stuff. But between that and I read a couple blogs and read Al Jazeera every morning and 2 or 3 blogs and the wires. So it takes me 2 hours in the morning to get through that routine.
Do you find that we have a lot more information today, or we don't, than when you were beginning?
Well, you have a lot more to get through that you didn't have access before to. But you can't get through all of it. You never could. I used to remember that every day in the newsroom, we used to get press releases picked up at every agency and delivered to the news desk, and it used to be about this high, and nobody read them. Nobody reads the record. The record is a fabulous place to get new information. But people don't do it. In part because so much of the space is taken up with events that are carried on before you, right in front of you, in order to get it in the paper. There is too much news that's fit to print. And the question is, who's pushing their way in to use up that space?
Here.
In regards to your experience in reporting on intelligence issues, how would you assess the impact of UAVs on signals intelligence in relation to traditional forms such as satellite imagery?
I think, UAVs have become the most important thing in warfighting. Whether they're that important, or even satellite imagery now on strategic targets, is something else again. Because people who want to hide things have learned how to hide things. But I think when it comes to battlefield stuff, UAVs, and particularly arming a predator, is a real knockout.
Literally.
Yeah.
Towson, one last question.
An issue that's been brought back to the forefront, maybe just in the past 3 or 4 months, is that of a proposed reinstating of the fairness doctrine in broadcast media, and I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? Would that be a good idea to reinstate it?
You had the fairness doctrine originally because there were limited numbers of outlets, and the government controlled all that. The irony now is that there are multiple electronic outlets, more than you can even think about, so that the audiences are smaller. The fairness doctrine was always something that was there for, I think, more for elections than anything else. And I think the problems of elections are real, but I don't know how you solve the problem of applying the fairness doctrine to advertising or electioneering advertising. The one problem with the fairness doctrine, if you go to the origins of it, which is monopoly, and therefore everybody ought to have fair access. Newspapers are now the monopolies, and I'd hate to see them try to apply a fairness doctrine to newspapers. They never could because they're not licensed. But I think part of the decline of the fairness doctrine was the multiplicity of outlets and the fact that it never really worked.
One last question here.
Hi. What do you see as the future of investigative journalism in the news media in light of the PR forces that are pushing things as things to be written about or reported on, and also how the newspapers and news television are going as a business, whether there's lower circulation of newspapers, lower readership, or
Well, good enterprise, good investigative stories, whatever you want to call it, help sell papers if they're real. My wife is judging a contest that had to do with mental health stories, and there was a piece out of the Oregonian which really was sensational and apparently drew a lot of readers. The problem is, in a PR society, it's hard to get newspapers to devote the time for enterprise because it's costly. And not every enterprise piece works. It's a gamble. So it really depends on the ownership and the management of the paper, where they're willing to devote assets to that. And I think if they do and they get the right kind of people, it actually is cost effective. They'll see results for it. But there's a fear of taking on controversial subjects and pursuing them. The other part of enterprise that I consider important, that I have a running thing with Bob Woodward about, is I think once you get into enterprise and expose something, for example, you're the one that's got to stay with it till there's some kind of accountability. In other words, I did Iran-Contra for 5 years because I still think that was a real misuse of government power. This counterintelligence field activity story, I keep writing about because I think it's wrong, and I think Congress has got to look at it, and when they look at it, I'll write about that. One of the problems with journalism is they expose something, then they go to something else. And to me, it's always led to this feeling the public has that everything's bad and nothing changes. I think if as much effort is put into exposing Abramov and the lobbyists is then carried on by the same people pressing reform, instead of then turning it over to the people who cover Congress who say nothing's going to happen, it'd be better. I mean, I think we ought to be responsible for what we expose because we want to make it better, not because we want to keep exposing bad things. There's a plus side of enterprise reporting or accountability or whatever you want to call it.
I have one last question on accountability. What do you think the impact has been of having an ombudsman in newspapers?
I think in general it's very good. I mean, I think each paper, I've always been against, there's always been some talk of a national board.
The National News Council?
Yeah, which is a dopey idea. Because every newspaper has different standards, every reporter has different standards. but somebody who's on the paper, who knows how it works, who's free to criticize, which is what the Post has had fairly regularly, is a good idea. Broader than that, I don't believe, I mean, I've tried to stay out of criticizing other reporters who do different things, or in the Plame case of Wenho Lee, how each one of us handled it, because we all handle it differently. I mean, the press is much too involved with itself in the first place, and we consider ourselves much too important, way over. I mean, my pet example is always about the reporter's privilege. You know, another silly thing I did was to go to law school and graduate from law school 5 years ago. I wrote a term paper on attorney-client privilege in the Vince Foster case, whether the attorney-client privilege lasts after death. But I had to study all the privileges. And you notice it's attorney-client privilege, it's doctor-patient privilege, it's priest-penitent, but it's reporter's privilege. Well, the fact is the privilege is really the source's privilege. Because the source can swear me to secrecy and then go to Jim Rice and go on the record with the same information. So I don't control it. The source does. And reporters call it a reporter's privilege because we're so egomaniacal that it all involves us. And they've gotten judges to believe it, which amazes me.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We appreciate it. It's very good.